Welcome back. A lot of focus is being put on the cost of food these days. Today, we're zeroing in on the quality of food. Before we do, a look at the size of the food industry in Canada by the numbers. According to StatsCan, for 2021, Canada's food system is worth about $135 billion, or almost 7% of our GDP. It employs 2.1 million Canadians. About a quarter of that is primary agriculture at almost $32 billion and more than 240,000 jobs. Food manufacturing is even bigger. The $33.2 billion industry is 1.7% of GDP, employing 303,000 people. And it is the largest manufacturing sector in terms of jobs and GDP, representing 17.8% of all manufacturing in Canada. The largest sector in the food business in Canada is processed meat at 25% of the total, valued at $35.6 billion. Food is a big export for Canada, worth $82.2 billion in 2021, making Canada the fifth largest exporter of agriculture and seafood in the world. But the domestic market is where it's at for big food in Canada. We spend $186.7 billion a year on it, making it the second largest household expenditure. So food is a big expenditure because it's not discretionary, but when it comes to the quality of what we're eating, we might want to be a little more discerning. And often, food that is marketed as a healthy alternative is anything but. Chris Van Tulleken is a podcaster and author of the new book, Ultra Processed People, Why We Can't Stop Eating Food That Isn't Food. Thanks for being with us.
It's such a pleasure to be here, Amanda.
So it feels like the right place to start is your definition of ultra-processed food, which is what's making us ultra-processed people. What is ultra-processed food?
So ultra-processed food isn't a lay term like junk food. It's got a formal scientific definition, so it's been used now to do research for over a decade. And the book is about not one, but hundreds of different scientific studies, which are very widely agreed on. So there's this long formal definition, but it boils down to this. If it's wrapped in plastic and it contains at least one ingredient you don't find in your kitchen at home, like an emulsifier or a stabilizer or a coloring, then it will be an ultra-processed food. And as you mentioned, a good indication is if there's a health claim on the packet, it's probably ultra-processed.
So interestingly, a lot of those kind of molecular changes that we've made that we now call food, the substitutions, have made food cheaper, more stable, long-lasting, all of the things, of course, that allow us to manufacture it in a big way and export it around the world. So the trade-off might be our health for some of those other benefits. Have we been too slow in looking at the trade-off and looking at what the disadvantages of all of that is?
So there are very few advantages to ultra-processed food other than cost. And so when we have this discussion, what's really important is we don't stigmatize the people who have to use this food. So I'm, as well as a podcaster, I'm a doctor in the UK and a scientist. And my most disadvantaged patients are the ones who eat the most of this food. In 2019, our poor diet globally replaced tobacco as the leading cause of early death. And ultra-processed food, which is what a poor diet means, is such a dominant part of our calorific intake that in the UK, in Canada, in the United States, it makes up on average about 60% of our calories. And it is the leading cause of health problems now in the northwest rich parts of the world. And it's increasingly a source of health problems in the global south as well. So the advantages are cost, especially at the moment, there's a cost of living crisis, but we do subsidize food. We have policies that regulate food markets. And so at the moment, governments are really favoring the production of these quasi-addictive substances that are extremely harmful.
And the addictive component here is something you address in your book. Something else you address that I think is important is when something is shown directly to cause harm. So, sometimes we talk about, cancer in lab mice. It will be taken off the market or we'd be advised against it. The World Health Organization is just putting sweeteners in that category. But when the effect is the damages are cumulative and or subtle, things like inflammation or damage to your metabolic system, how do we deal with that? How can scientists help us track that better?
So you're raising such a crucial question. Ultra-processed food is hard to study because it's such a wide category of food. Much of it is made in the same way, and we think it drives harm through some universal pathways. It's extremely energy dense, and it's generally very soft. So the addictive component of it, in part, comes from it being formulated so that it subverts our body's ability to say, I'm full, stop eating, because you consume the calories so quickly. Then there are the flavorings, the flavor enhancers, the emulsifiers. Some of these damage the microbiome, some of these cause direct inflammation, but the additives aren't the problem. The main problem is this entire range of food is made for the exclusive purpose of financialized growth. And that's a really important part of the definition of ultra-processed food. So for millennia, hundreds of millennia, food has been made in homes, mainly by female scientists, to nourish us, to nourish their friends, their family, and their communities. This is food that is really about extracting money from disadvantaged populations around the world and handing it to a very small number of transnational food companies. So it's not in that sense food.
Only seconds here. What do you hope happens with your book? What do you hope is the outcome of this book?
I hope that we reduce the stigma around obesity and diet-related disease, that people understand it is not them, it is the food. And I hope that we change the way governments and policymakers and charities and doctors and scientists interact with the companies that make this food.
Thank you so much for being with us. We appreciate your time.
Such a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Chris Van Tulleken is the author of Ultra-Processed People, Why We Can't Stop Eating Food That Isn't Food. So why isn't food better regulated so that more consumers are educated about what they're exposed to? Sylvain Charlebois is director of the Agri-Food Analytics Lab at Dalhousie University. Sylvain, great to have you with us.
Nice to be here.
So I do want to start with this question of how food is regulated, because some of the issues that are being raised here in this book aren't new. I mean, we know that food manufacturers have actually used labs for a long time to figure out how to trick our bodies into not being satiated, to make foods more addictive. Where is the regulator in all of this, and should we be doing a better job of overseeing this industry?
Well, in Canada, of course, Health Canada does the heavy lifting when it comes to what we should be allowed to eat and what we shouldn't be allowed to eat. And every time, of course, they review files submitted by companies. They look at sugar content, sodium content, and fat as well. And over the years, we have seen some great innovation, and sometimes we have seen not so great innovations being offered to us. So the oversight is, I would say, light at best when it comes to nutrition, but there are changes coming, and changes are going to be empowering consumers, which I think is the right thing to do. It is a method that is now used more and more often across the Western world.
If there's a message about how we eat from this particular book, it's just know what you're getting. But I think most people who read it will come away thinking, I should eat single-source food. I should eat just what comes from nature or from animals and not anything that's kind of combined with something else. There's a lot of different descriptions of what that kind of diet is, Sylvain. But would you agree that that's the healthiest way to go? I mean, is there science that says we shouldn't have additives, we shouldn't replace one molecule with another?
It's an ideal, but the reality is that people just don't have the time. That's the thing. And so the industry has tried to offer what we call convenience. When we go to the grocery store, we don't just buy calories and food, we buy convenience. And that's where the innovation is actually coming from a lot these days. But of course, we've compromised on nutrition, and that's why Ottawa is coming forward with the front of package labeling, which I think is the right thing to do. You basically give the information to consumers on site at the grocery store, let them decide what is good and what's so good. Clearly, within seconds, the consumer will know if this product is good or not. Forcing the industry to reformulate products, which is why I think a market-based approach to innovation is really the better way to do it, because it creates a level playing field for every company.
Although what Chris Van Tulleken would say is if it claims to be healthy, it's probably ultra-processed. That a health claim on a product is in itself a warning that you're getting something man-made.
Well, there is some disagreement in terms of what ultra-processed actually means. And I know that in the scientific literature, a lot of people do believe that ultra-processed means unhealthy. Not necessarily, not necessarily. That's why it's important to look at the content of the food, what's in the food, and we need to make sure that consumers are aware very quickly what's in the food with language they can actually understand.
Sylvain, so good to have your thoughts on this. Appreciate it.
Take care.
Sylvain Charlebois is director of the Agri-Food Analytics Lab at Dalhousie University. Coming up, a critique of a new clean fuel requirement is facing some political pushback. That's still ahead. But first, regulators in Europe have slapped a record $1.75 billion fine on Meta. The parent of Facebook and Instagram is accused of transferring user data from Europe to the United States. The company suggests that it would be hard to run a global internet firm and keep data siloed in each country, and is in fact working on a regulatory agreement for the data transfer. So why the fine? Maybe it's like the old bank robber joke, because that's where they keep the money. We're back after this.